complicated. Beginning tonight, Congressman Adam Smith, Democrat from Washington, ranking member on the House Armed Services Committee, former Marine Raider, CIA Special Activities Officer Elliot Ackerman, author of Sheepdogs, among a number of other New York Times bestsellers. Gentlemen, good to see you. Elliot, I want to start with you. This is late-breaking reporting from ABC News just in the past couple of minutes.
The two survivors climbed back onto the boat after the initial strike. They were believed to be potentially in communication with others and salvaging some of the drugs. Because of that, it was determined they were still in the fight and valid targets.
Elliot, do we have anywhere near enough information for those of us on cable news to opine on A, whether a war crime was committed, and B, who would be guilty of it if one was?
Well, I mean, to go all the way back to the ancients, Plato said the first casualty of war is the truth. And I don't know, given how politicized this incident is becoming, that we're necessarily going to ever know the real truth of what happened. But, one side, yes, if you have shipwrecked personnel and they are executed at sea, that is a war crime. If you have two personnel who are at sea trying to recover drugs, that is not necessarily a war crime. I think the one thing that's important to note, though, is that this entire incident is underpinned by the fact that these strikes, unlike the strikes around terrorism, aren't necessarily underpinned by an authorization for the use of military force, and that's complicating the matter.
Okay. The White House would counter that since they have declared these groups narco-terrorists, that they are terrorists, and therefore it's the same authorization. But, Congressman, that's to your point. You have questioned the legality of these strikes at all, saying drug runners do not necessarily constitute an immediate threat to the United States. You said, are we going to have the death penalty for drug runners? President Obama turned the U.S. Air Force into close air support for the Libyan rebels back in 2011. Here's how he justified it. Take a listen.
I've heard your argument for the...
There will be times, though, when our safety is not directly threatened, but our interests and our values are. But when our interests and values are at stake, we have a responsibility to act.
I was in Libya, Congressman, and the Libyan rebels nor Gaddafi's forces posed some kind of imminent risk to the United States, and it was a 6-month air campaign. So I'm just trying to figure out what the difference is.
Yeah. Look, if this is an example of a left-right balanced reporting, I'd hate to see what happens when you decide to be biased against us. I mean, that recitation of those facts leaves out so many things, it's hard to even know where to start. First of all, when this first happened, Secretary Hegseth said, didn't happen, fake news, made up. And then all of a sudden he said, yeah, Admiral Bradley ordered the second strike. So how do we know there was a second strike? Pete Hegseth said there was, okay? And yes, I have not said, string them up, not said any of that stuff. We're going to meet with Admiral Bradley tomorrow, and we're going to hear exactly what happened. It is interesting that President Trump, Secretary Hegseth, have refused to tell us exactly what happened. They know. They've dribbled out little stuff. They've lied repeatedly and then corrected themselves. They have every opportunity to do what you're asking for. They have not taken it. Now, we're going to try to talk to Admiral Bradley tomorrow and figure it out. And second, the key part is what your other guest here said. There was congressional authorization for what Obama did in that first clip that you talked about. And yes, we were dealing with known terrorists that had attacked us on 9/11. Libya was actually approved by the UN. It was a collective action, not the U.S. acting unilaterally. So there's all kinds of things that are different here. And yes, this should be investigated, but that was an incredibly biased take on this. And the final important point about this, again, no authorization.
I'm still trying to figure out what was biased.
These are cocaine boats in... Well, you laid out an entire argument that Democrats are full of it, basically, and Trump's right. Okay? You didn't get into what your guest just said, that there's no authorization on this. You didn't get... Well, you said a lot more than that over the course of the last 3 or 4 minutes. But let's put that aside for the moment. Now that I'm finally getting a chance to explain this. And also, if Donald Trump says, look, if you're a drug criminal, we're going after you, do we want to give Donald Trump the role of judge, jury, and executor for everybody who's dealing drugs? And not to pick nits here, but those people are not actually trying to kill Americans. They're trying to make money. They're trying to sell drugs.
No,
and that's different than what happened on 9/11.
I understand the distinction.
And we need
in
to
the
stand
argument.
up and fight back against drug dealers, but is this actually working? And you could have put some of that in your opening monologue if you wanted it to be legitimately left-right. It really wasn't. Now, we're going to get to the answer, and I'm with you. No one should be convicting anyone of a war crime right now. Nobody should be doing that. But there are serious questions that need to be raised, not just about the September 2nd strike, but about all of these strikes. What is the authorization? How is this protecting us?
That is a different argument.
What they showed us on all of the Obama stuff, they showed us the intel. They showed us who these people were and who we were going after. Were they surrounded by civilians, and did we make some mistakes? Yes. We never targeted a civilian. We targeted terrorists who were a threat and tried to calculate, are there civilians around? Is this the best place to take the shot? Is that the best place to take the shot? I got to get to Elliot in a second,
but I want to just follow up on one thing here.
All of that.
You're saying, hold on, yes. I want to go back to Libya, though, because it's important. Because you're saying, though, it's now the UN that gets to decide when American forces are put into war and the president can go to the UN rather than going to Congress?
There are legitimate complaints about what happened in Libya, and those complaints were raised at the time by a variety of people, Democrats and Republicans alike, okay? But it is different when it was also a NATO operation. It was a collective operation. And I think that it wasn't sold as we're trying to protect the U.S. from an attack. It was a different thing. So, but there's a lot of nuances, and I will agree with your overarching point. Anyone who comes on television and says, convict Pete Hegseth of a war crime now, is wrong. But they could be a lot more forthcoming with the information necessary to figure out what happened. So we'll see if they do that, and if they do that, we can come back on and talk about the facts once we know them.
Yeah, that would be helpful, and I think the facts obviously will help, as will the truth that Elliot points out is often the first victim in war. Elliot, I want to get you on this because you made a point that war crimes have now become partisan, which is a bad thing, I think, objectively. But this idea that simply a double tap, a triple tap, a quadruple tap, in and of itself is somehow unusual. You called in these strikes in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in other places. I feel like this is sort of standard procedure, that if the first thing doesn't achieve the objective, the first strike, then you keep striking the target until objective is met, correct?
I mean, listen, tactically, you can be extremely aggressive so long as you're operating in a theater where you have a legal war declared. And the challenge we have right now is that President Trump has never gone to Congress, which is the fact of going to the American people to express his intent as to what this war is about. You have Secretary Hegseth, who said he's very pro-troops, will stand behind the troops, will always have their backs. But his actions show that he doesn't have their backs because he's making individuals like Admiral Bradley, who I assure you does not want to be in front of Congress tomorrow, he's making them extremely vulnerable because now all of their actions can come into question because they're not on a legally authorized battlefield. I mean, I fought in Iraq. I fought in the Second Battle of Fallujah. Our rules of engagement going into Fallujah in November 2004 were all military-age males have been declared hostile. That meant we could kill anyone who was a military-age male in that city. Those were extremely lax rules of engagement, and they were such because that was going to be a highly kinetic battle. But we could operate with those rules of engagement because we were basically in a war that Congress had authorized based off of the 2001 authorization for the use of military force that came after September 11th. Because at the time, President Bush went through a process with the Congress. Trump hasn't done any of that. And because of that, you
gentlemen both make a great point.
Were shooting at you.
Yeah, and they were,
people were shooting at you.
Well,
you were at risk, at high risk. So those rules of engagement need to be there. We've got drones shooting at a boat that isn't shooting at any U.S. person right now.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Excellent insight from both of you. Congressman Adam Smith, Elliot Ackerman, thank you. Democrats say last night's special election proves they can retake the House, even the Senate,